Afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. This is a discussion about the messages that aid and faith organisations would like to send to world leaders this week as they gather in Cornwall. I don't know what we might realistically expect and how we perhaps respond to the gap between hope and reality, which might open up over the next few days. We've got a great and distinguished panel of guests here, and I'll be talking to them. I hope they'll be talking with one another, and I hope you'll enter the conversation as well by putting in questions and comments in the chat box. I will then either field them for you or I'll come to you directly. So please do engage, and I will try and keep an eye on that chat box as it goes. I'd like to start by hearing from Karimi Kinoti. Karimi is head of Christian Aid's Africa division. Christian Aid has got offices in 10 African countries. She herself is in Nairobi. Karimi, welcome. Africa's got a guest at this summit in the former South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa. But I wonder how the African countries that you're involved with might be viewing this summit.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Yes, indeed, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa is the guest from Africa to the G7 summit. He will, of course, be representing his country, South Africa, but he's also representing the 54 nations of Africa. And specifically, he will be coming to the G7 summit to persuade the leaders to agree on a waiver on the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement for COVID. As we have seen, many countries within the G7 have reached where they wanted to go with vaccines. However, in Africa, that is not the case. In Africa, we have as little as 2.6 doses per 100 people. And so even as the G7 is discussing almost a post-COVID world, trade agreements, issues to do with the global health system, etc. The problem is that COVID-19 vaccines have not been seen as a global public good. And so many of the countries where Christian Aid is present, but I would say across the sub-Saharan Africa, the whole question of when these vaccines will be available, whether it is through donations from the wealthier countries, or whether that is through the ability of some of the countries, such as South Africa, to manufacture them so that they are available.
So that's about intellectual property rights to produce the vaccine themselves. That's what you're wanting.
Well, that is one thing, but there is also the commitment that the G7 countries, as well as other countries that have excess doses of COVID-19, have said that they would, through the COVAX facility, provide those. Well, the reality is in some of the countries, including Kenya, only about 1 million people out of 50 or so million people have got AstraZeneca. And of those, the first dose, second dose has not come through. And there is no idea of when those doses will come through. So there's the question of production, but there's also the question of sharing the resources when it comes to the vaccine. So I would say that is one expectation of our African governments. I would say the second one, which given that the UK government is hosting both the G7 as well as the COP26 in November, is around climate finance. Many of our countries are bearing the brunt. Many of our communities on the ground are bearing the brunt of climate change. And so the question of the financing that goes from the rich countries, including the G7 countries, to the poorer countries to enable them to be more climate resilient with regard to adapting floods, droughts, unpredictable rain, food insecurity issues, displacements of people, but also the mitigation side, knowing that we, as a continent, in terms of the emissions, carbon emissions is at 4% or so. But yet, as we look at development, the opportunity with renewable energy and renewable energy technology, given the sun, for example, the wind, and so on, have a huge opportunity to leapfrog the development pathway using renewables. Those renewable technologies do need to be accessible, affordable, and linked to that, both the financing as well as the technology side is the opportunity really to enable equitable development of communities. I'd say the third one, if I may, and I'll stop there, is the compounded crisis. We've talked about COVID, we've talked about climate, is debt. Debt distress for many of our countries. Again, giving an example from Kenya, this afternoon as we speak, our Treasury Secretary in the Kenya government is delivering the financial budget for 2021-2022. It is a deficit budget. It is a budget that causes him a headache and causes the citizens of the country a headache. Because, as I say, much of the debt, or rather much of the financial resources in the budget is going to debt repayment. It is estimated that that is 53% of the budget, which then means that there is hardly any money for the public health issues that we've just been talking about around COVID, similarly for health. At the same time, many jobs that have been lost, livelihoods that have been lost. And so the whole question of how does the G7 look at these issues? They're beginning, they want to talk about trade. They want to talk as if, everybody is in a post-COVID world. And so the question of how does debt restructuring happen in ways that ease the burden for countries in Africa is quite important.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to come back to some of those issues in a bit more detail shortly. Father Augusto Zampini, you're the Adjunct Secretary of the Vatican Dicastery for Integrated Human Development, and you're joining us, I think. And you'll see in a moment, everybody, why I think I can safely award the prize for the best Zoom background today to this contributor. But the Pope hasn't actually been invited to send a message to G7, but messages are coming all the time out of the Holy See about what's needed at this G7 summit. How would you summarise the key points that Pope Francis would want to be making, and the Vatican's department that you're working for is working on?
The first message, thank you, Rosie. The first message is about inequality. The pandemic has exacerbated all the inequalities around the world. But we can see this, we can all see this in the vaccine rollout, where here in Europe or in the US, well, we're not that bad, but in most countries in the world, we are. So that's a scandal. It particularly is a scandal about public health administration worldwide. It's a scandal, it's a socio-political scandal, and it's a moral scandal. That's why it's so important for religions and for faith people. The vaccines, if they are to bring any hope that we are to end the pandemic, they should be for all, and especially for the most vulnerable. But that's common sense, not for a few. If we keep this in trying to get vaccines just for a few, first of all, it won't work. So all our efforts, all our lockdowns, all our, they will be in vain. But most importantly, there are people dying because of COVID. There are people really anxious. There are people struggling, and we should take this into account. The universal access for vaccination, this is what the Pope is putting about. It's about caring for ourselves, for our families, and for all those who are around us. But with the COVID, because the COVID, as any virus, doesn't know any frontier, any barrier. So the solution to the pandemic cannot be limited by frontiers and barriers. As simple as that. It's about the message of hope. If we are to tackle this pandemic, we cannot do it individualistically with another virus, the Pope says, the virus of individualism. Individualism could be personal or collective or regional. No, if we are to really cure the world, we need to tackle also this virus. It has to be a collective effort, but or the law. What is the main law that should rule over this tackling the pandemic or addressing the pandemic? It's the law of love. What the Pope is calling love is also social. Love is political. Love is not just interpersonal, and this law should prevail over other laws. That doesn't mean that other laws are not important, but the laws of the market. But we create the market. Why don't we cannot change it? The law of intellectual property rights. My father was a specialist in intellectual property rights in Argentina, so I learned a lot from that. The intellectual property rights is a wonderful creation to help societies to develop, to improve the quality of life, to flourish. Now, is it not a paradox that the intellectual property rights now is preventing society from flourishing, from developing? So we can do something. Now, the problem with the G7 is only the G7, that are the most powerful countries in the world, can really push for the temporary suspension of intellectual property rights. So that's why I hope that they can really discuss this. It's a bit funny that the same day that the Pope explicitly talked about this, it was in a Bach's concert. It's also Prince Harry talked about that. Even President Biden talked about that. So why, if people so different are aligned in these things, why can we not do it? We can. But the other message, perhaps is very, very important, if we want to tackle this with the law of love, is to free people from the barriers that prevent them from living, and that is the debt. That's we were called. And I like to explain this in a personal capacity, because I used to live for 2 years in a shanty town in Greater Buenos Aires, and when people are over indebted, they can and suddenly your daughter gets sick, you have to ask for money to pay for the operation. And you can cure your daughter, but you know that you will struggle for life, all the family. So that's what's happening to a poor country that are already over indebted, and suddenly they have to buy vaccines to cure their people. So this is the time to cancel that, so to allow the countries to cure their people, or to free the rights to produce vaccines so that they can cure their own people, that it will be beneficial for all. This is what the Pope is trying to push. The law of love should prevail in not the recovery. We don't want to recover anything that is unfair and just and unsustainable. We want to push for something new and to bring hope to people for something new.
And also to help poorer countries address the sort of climate emergency that they're facing. And I understand that Alok Sharma, who's going to be presiding at COP26, was at the Vatican recently. Did those conversations give you hope for some sort of delivery from COP in December?
Yes and no. Yes, because there's a lot of goodwill, particularly in the organizers of COP26. So congratulations for all of them. They were very thrilled with our Laudatos action platform. There are 7 years of ecological conversion of 7 groups of people that are from families to workers to dioceses and congregations, hospitals, schools, universities, you name it, with 7 years, seven group of people, 7 Laudato Si goals. No, 7 is the group, the number of perfection. And there's, you have to come to the COP and tell this, because only from religious people can push for an ecological conversion that comes from the heart, and that it will be sustainable on time, and that brings hope. No, but there is a problem. If we don't get this vaccine thing right, if we don't get the debt right, how on earth are we going to tackle the climate crisis? So this is my reservation to the COP26.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rowan Williams is with us. He's the chair of Christian Aid. Dr. Williams, I know it's a bit of a no-brainer to say that this is a World Summit unlike any other because of this global situation. But I wonder if you could just speak to that and to the opportunities and dangers that that holds.
The key word is opportunity here. I think what we've already heard from speakers today is a very clear message that there are three deeply interconnected problems that need to be tackled. And it's impossible to address any one of them successfully without looking at the others. And those are, as we've heard, the pandemic, the environmental crisis, and the issue around debt. Now, you could say from one point of view, it's a perfect storm. From another point of view, of course, it's an opportunity for a joined up response of a kind that we haven't yet seen. If it's possible for the G7 leaders in the coming days to see these issues as completely interconnected, it's one of those rare moments where we can actually say we have learned something. Quite often people say, well, what have we learned in the year or so of tackling the pandemic? And there are many kinds of answer, but I hope one of the answers is exactly what Father Zampini has just underlined, and that is our absolute interdependence. The way in which a genuinely global crisis requires a genuinely global response. And a genuinely global response requires us to keep our eyes on the connection between the sorts of crisis that we have. So just to fill that out a tiny bit more, it seems to me that what we're talking about this week, what we're hoping for from the G7 leaders, is a mixture of what I call negative and positive reactions. There are some negatives, some things we should stop doing. And I think the suspension of intellectual property rights in the way that's been talked about is one of those things. Likewise, debt cancellation or rescheduling is one of those negatives. But the positives are what we actually invest at this point in building long-term capacity, sustainability in vulnerable societies. That means thinking not only about intellectual property rights with vaccinations, it also means what we do to increase the long-term capacity for healthcare that exists in vulnerable economies. What are the things that make healthcare vulnerable and insecure in such contexts? Well, among other things, as Karimi has said, debt. You can look at somewhere like Tanzania as well as Kenya, where I think I'm right in saying that the servicing of debt in Tanzania already exceeds the sum that goes towards national health care. And in the context of that, to ask the further positive question, what is it that continues to destabilize a lot of economies across the world at this particular point? It's the inexorable advance of climate change, climate-related issues which press upon already vulnerable economies in a quite disproportionate way. So when you start thinking about those connections, you see that, yes, there are some fairly straightforward negatives, but there are also some positives. There are some challenges to do something which actively invests in the future of other countries because it's an investment in the future of the entire human family. If it's the case, as we've already heard, that there's this massive shortfall in vaccine availability as between, say, Europe and Africa, I think it's at the moment an average of 100% plus vaccine availability in the UK to 2 to 3% availability in Africa. There's something that has to be done about that. And that will require, as President Biden has reminded us, some very positive action, some real investment. And the proposal is that the G7 countries commit to covering, I think it's 63% of the existing 19 billion shortfall in the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator program. And that's something which could be done, which I would say has to be done this week if we're to step up to the plate. And if our own country really means what it says about taking a leadership role in this meeting and in the world, if all this stuff we've heard about global Britain is not just waffle, then I think it's time for our own government and our own leadership to step up and say this is necessary. So I think the opportunity is precisely that, joined up thinking, making sure that the clear message comes that any one of these areas addressed on its own won't be transformed. If we can see them together, there's a real chance of, as Father Zampini has said, justice and love emerging as the leading principles for this meeting and for what lies beyond it.
Thank you. Shahin Ashraf is head of Global Advocacy at Islamic Relief. Shahin, you're there, aren't you? And you were part of a group called Crack the Crisis, which delivered a petition to Downing Street ahead of the summit. Can you just tell us what that was demanding and asking of G7 leaders?
Yes, thank you very much, Rosie. Yes, the petition was demanding G7 leaders to act upon the aid cuts, which are disproportionately affecting the vulnerable communities, as well as places like what we see is almost a reduction of 60% of support in countries like Yemen and Syria. For us, I think when we're looking at the widespread and severe hunger after years of conflict, what you will find is the very critical funding gaps that are meant to be there as part of as providing, humanitarian assistance. Those are one of the messages that we raised to the G7 leaders, and the message that we delivered to Downing Street yesterday. But as a round of that, Rosie, we also spoke about the second round of aid cuts that the UK government is further reducing, and that means what we will see is 700,000 fewer girls supported by girls' education, 2 million fewer women supported by humanitarian assistance, 8 million fewer women and girls supported by nutrition interventions, and 9 million fewer women supported to access clean health and water. And it kind of goes back to what Karimi said, when we're speaking about inequality and what Father Zampini spoke about, those areas of those round of aid cuts do disproportionately affect at least about 20 million women and girls worldwide, as well as the major humanitarian crisis when it comes to famine around the world. And that's the petition we delivered yesterday. But I guess the overwhelming topic of famine will be taken up at the G7, and I think, as others have said, particularly Archbishop Rowan Williams, who had spoken about actually this is the time that we should show moral courage and moral leadership in issues that affect the world. And I think the other thing around climate change, people speak about building back better. I would say that we should try and build back differently. Thank you, Rosie.
Can I bring in Ruth Valerio from Tearfund and Christine Allen from CAFOD at this point as well? I mean, Ruth, you're in Cornwall. You didn't go by plane, I understand. Why is it important that you and others are actually there in person, do you think? And can you tell us about some of the things that are going to be going on in Cornwall over the next few days?
Yeah, thank you. I just want you to know I came down by electric car and did not come I decided to leave my private jet in my back garden.
What, no bike? Go on.
Yeah, that would have taken me a bit longer. Yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm here as part of the Crack the Crisis coalition as a spokesperson, really to speak up on all of the issues that our contributors have so far highlighted so well. And I know we are all here speaking from the same perspective and speaking with one voice. There's a range of different things that are going to be happening here. Something very exciting happening early tomorrow morning that I'm not going to tell you anything more about at the moment. There's an interfaith service that myself and some others are involved with at Truro Cathedral this evening. A beach vigil both at Cardiff Bay and in Falmouth, near Falmouth, that the Crack the Crisis Coalition have been organising, really to bring people together for a moment to reflect on the impact that the pandemic has been having, and wanting to bring in that note of remembrance and of reflection through all of the political jamboree and the media rounds that will be happening over these next few days. And exactly as the other contributors have said, we're here wanting to bring our attention to these different issues of economy, ecology, society, and highlighting that these things work together, and you cannot tackle one without tackling all of them together. And this G7 conference is such an opportunity for us to bring about, for our governments to bring about some key changes in helping us to build back better, but to build back really along better lines that feed into resilient communities and into sustainable communities. When we look at the huge challenges that we're facing, we know that we are on the wrong track, socially, economically, environmentally. And through all of the horrors of the pandemic, it has presented us with an opportunity to do something different. And I think if there's one thing that I would want to take away from this discussion and from the last year, is, as we think about that theme of opportunity, is that actually we have discovered that we can do some amazingly unexpected things. When faced with an unprecedented emergency, we can change. We are resilient, we can be creative, we can conjure up the money when it's needed. We can do things, and I would love us to be approaching G7 and this whole year, this golden thread, with the golden thread of climate, as Boris Johnson has said, as we look to the different opportunities of this year. Yes, there is a realism. We know that often these things don't deliver the kinds of things we're wanting them to deliver. But also, I hope we come in looking at what we have achieved and knowing that we can be creative and we can respond to an emergency when we need to. And I hope it's in that spirit that our global leaders are going to come together.
Thank you. I mean, Christine, that was a very hopeful contribution from Ruth there. And you were talking to the other day about the mood in 2015 when the Pope published Laudato Si ahead of the Paris Agreement, and the change of atmosphere almost in the summit that followed. How significant do you think a papal contribution at COP26 might be? We talked about the role of faith. It was very easy to concentrate on one or two faith leaders, but it's pretty difficult to ignore the contribution that one man could make there, isn't it?
Thanks, Rosie. Well, yes, I was in Paris in 2015 for the climate negotiations, and I heard world leader after world leader talk about the moral imperative to tackle climate change. And that was a very different kind of narrative than it had ever been in any previous COP before. So it was a significant shift. And I know that people there told me that it was there had been such an influence from the Pope as a result of that. Now, Laudato Si reflects, 6 years on, it reflects, and it's still as important as ever for the church. And as Father Augusto has talked about, we've had the Laudato Si action plan to take things forward for the next period of time. I think we need to remember that one of the reasons why the Pope is important is obviously his role as a spiritual leader, the vast trajectory and tradition of Catholic social teaching that he speaks on, but it's also the church talks from its real and lived experience. CAFOD is part of the Global Caritas Confederation, 160 countries, 160 local Caritas agencies all around the world who are delivering desperate need services and support now, this instance. The church provides huge amounts of health and social care and education services right around the world. And I know other faiths do the same. And yet, so often, as it is in many places, the voices of ordinary people, and particularly the voices of those who are poor and powerless, are not heard. They're not at the table. They're not being able to influence the G7. And one of the things I think that the Pope does is that he helps bring those voices, that perspective of what does the world look like when you're poor and powerless, not when you're the powerful. And that's a reality that our politicians need to hear. I was in a meeting with one of the COP26 ministers just a couple of weeks ago, and she was absolutely enthused at talking about a particular family that she'd met, and how they had overseas in Costa Rica, I think it was, and how they were doing these very simple adaptations. And I thought, you know, this is our bread and butter. This is the stuff we are doing on a daily life, but you have had your eyes opened by this. And I think that's something that we as ordinary people, as people of faith, and as people of strong moral values, if you like, need to be bringing that perspective to our politicians all the time. And we need to continue to do it. And I know that over the last year, you know, there's been 13,000 CAFOD supporters that have been engaging in working with their MPs and influencing on social justice. And I'm sure every other organisation that's part of this conversation and the crisis have been doing the same. So I think we need to be using our voice a whole lot better. And if you as media people can help us do that, all the more.
Martin Palmer's posted in the chat box. We've been talking about governments, but it is, you know, it's the role of civil societies, as you've just been talking about, really, Christine, about the difference that people make on the ground working in their different capacities. Martin, do you just want to come in and just talk a little bit about the role that faith groups can have? Well, they might not be in government, but what they're doing with their money and their clout.
Thank you, Rosie. We're delighted to do so, and lovely to be with you all again. I'm a member of the Pope's COVID Commission, and so work very closely with Father Augusto, and in fact, between FaithInvest and the dicastery, we're making a joint appointment on how to help develop financial programs for the Catholic churches to be active. And on the Pope's COVID Commission, we've had a running debate between those who think that the Pope should just lobby and write letters and complain, and that's the role of religion. And those of us who are actually saying, well, let's start putting our own house in order, which in fact the Pope has been doing very extensively, so that we can actually say, look, we're the third largest investing group in the world. We run 50% of all schools, a third of all universities, a third of all hospitals. We are a major purchaser of energy and power. We've made huge changes. Why aren't we at the table? Why are we not there as, for example, running more schools in the Catholic Church than there are schools in the whole of North America? Why are we not there? That's because we've kind of assumed our only role is to stand outside and shout. I think it's time, and I'm delighted the way that the Pope's COVID Commission is moving, that we actually start saying, look, we're putting our own house in order. Therefore, we have models and examples to share with you. We can show you how you can change an economy. We can show you how you can change your investment portfolios. We can show you how you can develop educational programs that actually prepare people for the changes that are coming, as well as try and address them. And I just fear sometimes that the attitude of the faiths is that we are not that important. We are. We are major stakeholders in the planet, and we need to actually step up to that, as well as raising the moral issues. But it is a wee bit like sort of taking the speck out of somebody else's eye and not noticing the beam in our own. If we can do both, then I think we are in a much stronger position, not just to be lobbyists, but to actually be the agents of stakeholder change.
Yeah, I'd like to hear it for the shouters as well, because I think that's terribly important to be shouting. But when you say what faith groups can teach you, how do you get to actually engage with governments on these issues? That's the question. What we're addressing here is, how do you get governments to listen to what your people, your groups are engaged in?
Well, let's take one very simple example. As I said, the third largest invested group in the world are the faiths. And when they move, things change. So for example, we're now helping about $1.5 trillion worth of investments, faith investments, that have decided they want to shift, not just into impact investing, which is a bit of a screen, but actually into fundamental change. And as a result of that, we're now in conversations with the World Bank to create a whole new fund called the Just Transition Fund, which will primarily be, if you like, a kind of religious development fund, primarily funded through, or not funded, but fundamentally financed through the major religions, actually putting a proportion of their funding into this, which can then go into, for example, climate investment fund programs. Now, we're able to do that because we're actually showing that something is moving. And by showing that something is moving, you then get the attention of those who know we have to move, but who are often locked into political structures. Very interesting that we were very involved with the 2015 Paris agreements. We helped bring together faith leaders, philosophers, artists, musicians, etc. beforehand to sort of try and change the culture. And one of the comments that came back from the UN was that when the faiths talk about what they're going to do, it's about how much more we can do. When governments talk about what they're going to do, it's how little can we get away with. That's what we need to bring.
How do we get, I don't know who this is for, maybe you, Dr. Williams, how are governments encouraged to see things holistically? You know, it's they've got so much to manage. You have to do a bit of siloing. How do you appoint somebody for, you know, holistic government? How do we encourage them to look at things and see those connections that have been so apparent to everybody over the last year?
I think the culture of government at the moment is very short-termist, because we're in a bit of an attention deficit society in some ways. But I couldn't agree more with what Martin says about the need to have clear narratives that we can share to say, this is how it can be done. And whether it's in education, in, I suppose, microfinance, local development projects, gender-related programs, you know, we do have quite a lot in our bank account to say, you know, this is how it can be done, and this is how it can be delivered locally. One of the great strengths that I think a lot of faith-based development organizations have is that they know what it's like on the front line, and they know what it's like to deliver at appropriate scaled levels, rather than top-down artificial schemes. Now, that's what we have to try to share, I think, with government. And it's a bit of a struggle, because the default setting for, as we all know, for a lot of government development programs is the top-down model. And it's quite hard to shake that. But the more we can point to things that are actually happening, measurable, deliverable results of the sort that Martin has mentioned, of the sort that all those involved in development in this panel will know about, the more we can do that, the more I think we shall have the chance of making the difference we need to make. And just the final point, which is made again and again by some people, but I associate especially with how Gordon Brown has talked about this issue. Advocacy and community work by faith groups is part of what gives governments permission. It tells them that there is a substantive portion of the electorate prepared to step up to the plate on this, and it says, don't be nervous. It can be done. We're with you when you take risks on this. I think that is a significant part of what we can do.
And that's part of the Development Agency's role, isn't it, Christine or Karimi? Maybe you could speak to this about how you help build civil society engagement in the countries that you're working with, so that they can call their governments to account in the way these challenges are being met. I don't know if either of you would like to share an example where that happens.
I think it's Martin who's talked about stakeholders. And for citizens, and here when I talk about citizens, I'm talking about every single person in a country, understanding that they have a voice. In many of our countries in Africa, we listen to what our faith leaders say to us. We listen to what governments say. And so really getting a grandmother, a young girl, a boy, someone without a job, to realize that they have a voice. Some of that does require, I guess you'd call it creating consciousness. So to appreciate that when I open my voice, when I open my mouth, there's something there to be said. And so we have found, for instance, maybe if I can give an example, with our village savings and loans associations, and how important as women in a village put together a few pennies every week and share that, but also realize beyond that, they can go to their district administrator and demand that there are health facilities that provide equipment for mothers not to die from childbirth. And I want to talk about civil society from that perspective, rather than some of the movements and so on, but to say that very much from the grassroots, people coming together, understanding that they should make demands, understanding they should find out the VAT that they're paying. Where is that tax going? What does it do for them? And I think building civil society, even from small units, yet I would say powerful units, is quite important.
Yeah, I absolutely support Karimi there. And I think that is a very important role of development organizations, faith-based development organizations, which, development organizations often have a bit of a bad press because it's seen to be a very top-down, it's part of, colonial aid, all that kind of stuff. My experience, and I've worked for Christian Aid as well, but of faith-based organizations, particularly ones that, like us, that work with local partners, supporting local organizations, absolutely critical in helping to build and develop the capacity of local people and local organizations to speak for themselves. We don't come in with the answer. We stand alongside to help them grow and develop. So I'm so proud, for instance, that Caritas Goma hardly gets any money from CAFOD now, whereas years ago it was very dependent on us, because they're almost, they're bigger than us. They're doing stuff and they're influencing their own governments. And that's because we've known and recognized that our role is to stand alongside them and support it. It doesn't often get the headlines. But of course, our role is really important in helping to connect that local to the global, if you like. And all of the agencies, the CAFOD, Christian Aid, Tearfund, have supported local partners in speaking at things like World Social Forums or the UN processes that led to the Sustainable Development Goals and the COP. And one final point about the COP is, everyone's focused in on the fact that it's the conference, but the reality of the COP process, of course, is that it's very kind of decentralized. And what is happening at the moment is national countries are having to reassess their what are called national determined contributions, the way in which they are each contributing to us hitting or not hitting, as the point, more to the point of that reduction in greenhouse gases. And that's happening in every country. And we're all supporting local partners and local organizations to influence their own governments in doing that. But the reality is we have to recognize the systemic inequalities in our world, as Father Augusto and others have talked about, that mean that there are countries and communities that are more powerless in our reality. And they're powerless because of things like having to spend money on debt repayments, or they're getting the wrong kind of investment in, say, fossil fuel rather than investments in renewable energy. So our responsibility as the rich countries towards climate justice is about making sure that that money helps countries that are having to either to release the funding or to be able to invest in the right kind of way out for the future. And we shouldn't be holding them back. Although the British government has made the commitment to cancel fossil fuel investments through its overseas development assistance, it's still some is still going on. So we need to see the words and the rhetoric turned into actual action.
Thank you. If there's anyone on the call who hasn't spoken yet and would like to ask a question or make a contribution, please do shout loudly in the chat box now. Alex Kirby, I hope you don't mind me calling you a veteran environmental journalist. You worked for the BBC for many years and you then went on to co-found the Climate News Network. You know, going back to the G7, as someone who's reported on many previous summits, how do you see this one as being different, if it is? Is there any more acknowledgement of where responsibility for the climate emergency lies? Is there any more political will to deal with it? And finally, can you give an example of one potential G7 or COP decision or one initiative somewhere which, if replicated, might help us all feel a bit better about the world we're bequeathing to our children?
Well, thank you very much, Rosie. Taking G7 and the COP together, yes, there are differences. I mean, for one thing, we are no longer a member of the European Union. Mr. Trump has gone from office. The US is back and taking climate more seriously. China is taking seriously. Those last three, or last two, are positives. You talk about whether this is going to be different, the G7 and the COP. Yes, I think they are going to be different in other ways as well. And can I just take two words that other people have used speaking this morning? One is what Lord Williams said about interdependence. And I think that's one of the most important words I've heard used today. If anything should have taught us the importance of interdependence, it is the pandemic, which has shown us that until everyone is vaccinated, it's hardly worthwhile anyone being vaccinated. We sink or swim together in this. It's a lesson reinforced by the natural world. It's a lesson that applies equally, I think, or with more force to the climate. The other word that I heard used that I found very important and I'll take away is Father Zampini's reference to the virus of individualism. And what I'm afraid of is that both the G7 and the COP are going to be marked by an emphasis on individualism. We have now, as Prime Minister, a man who talks of wanting world-beating UK leadership, but who has engineered our exit from the European Union, who has cut the UK's policy on development aid by from 0.7 to 0.5% of GDP, a man who pursues an inhumane, deeply inhumane migration policy and pursues within this country savage austerity. All of those, I think, are damaging in themselves and show a mentality of individualism, which is flatly opposed to what we need to mitigate the climate ecology crisis. So, yes, there is a danger that both of these are going to be marked by an individualism, which perhaps that policy's perpetrators don't realize that they're doing, but they are, and that can be very, very damaging, I think. There was a wise man I knew at the master of an Oxford college, the warden of a college, Sir Crispin Tickell, a former ambassador, who once said to me, you know, when we talk about conserving the environment, the hardest thing of all we need to do is to find new ways of thinking. And if somehow we can overcome the individualism with the interdependence, then maybe we can find those new ways of thinking. I would not like to try to identify one particular thing that is going to help us, because it's not a question of one initiative. We should be thinking all the time of what our impact is going to be on the poor of the world, on those affected by climate, by pandemics, by whatever the threat may be. If you insist on my trying to identify one initiative, I would say that every G7 member should leave Carbis Bay undertaking to reach that country's commitments to fund developing countries' Paris Agreement emissions cuts by 2030, or else be barred from G7 membership until
this was the 100 billion that was committed but hasn't yet been delivered. Is that right?
And not very much of it has been committed. And then beyond that, with Glasgow and the COP, I think every country that signed up to the Paris Agreement should leave Glasgow having signed a timetable for cutting their emissions by a given amount by 2030. And if by 2030 they have not reached that commitment, they should lose developed world climate funding until they have reached it.
Very good. Sticks and carrots, maybe. Ruth Valerio, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one commitment that would be great to see being made would be that a minimum of 40% of total COVID recovery spending is spent on clean investments and on priorities that align to the climate commitments that have been made. And we're going to see probably a raft of amazing statements coming out of this, but we, as has been said, we need to move from statements down to practical delivery plans, which then have to be outworked in actual policy delivery at a government, at a country level, which is then where the role of civil society in holding governments to account is so important, because over the decades, we've seen so many grand statements and commitments being made, but they don't come down then to the actual timelines of what's going to be delivered, which then crucially has to come down to the policies. And so the advocacy discussion that we were having a while ago is such an important part of that. And just one thing that's been going round my mind and exercising me recently has been around faith literacy. I am convinced that we're actually not going to tackle any of these problems unless we work with faith communities, unless we see the major faiths of the world energized and motivated and working with government. And we're not going to see these things tackled unless we can help our governments understand how to work with faith communities, because for 80% or so of the world's population, it is faith commitments that motivate them to act and that underpin and frame their worldviews. So one of the things that I've been thinking around is, even if we do see vaccines released, how are we then going to counter the misinformation that will then prevent people from taking them? So I was just talking a couple of days ago with our country directors from Malawi and Cote d'Ivoire, who was saying that nobody wants to take the vaccine, even when the Prime Minister has a picture of him taking it. People say, oh, it's just got water in it. They believe that if they take the vaccine, they're going to die within 2 or 3 years. And that's where faith communities and faith leaders can be really helping to be working, to be getting across the positive messages and combating the misinformation. I know it's something we've been doing in Zambia and Malawi and other countries, as I'm sure the other organizations represented here are too. So because faith leaders are they are influential in their local communities, they can reach into areas where local authorities might not be able to reach. They have that high standing, they're respected. So they will be able to be putting across those messages in a way that government might not be able to. So we have to work together, and we have to help our governments gain that greater faith literacy.
Right, okay, we're nearly out of time, but I've got 2 questions here. If we could have very brief questions and very brief answers, please. The first one, actually, Catherine Peppenster, you wanted to ask a question. I don't know whether you want to put it to Father Augusto or...
Well, yes, that might be a good thing. Hello, Augusto, haven't seen you for ages, good to see you. The thing I was wondering about was that Christine Allen had mentioned that Laudato Si came out before Paris and it had an impact, that leaders started talking about a moral imperative. But now 6 years down the line, have things really changed that much? So what this time do we need to happen? Does this mean that the Pope himself has to come to COP26, for example? Or do we need to change the message? Is it no longer going to work to talk about moral imperatives and to be altruistic? This time round, do we have to talk to politicians and leaders of the Western nations about enlightened self-interest?
Thank you, Catherine, and good to see you. Yes, the message of Laudato Si has to be implemented. Remember that Laudato Si is not an encyclical to be read, but it's an encyclical to be lived. And because it's about the socio-economic, political thing, it's about also education, and it's about spirituality. And that's what I liked that Alex was mentioning, individualism as opposed to interdependency. But others were saying, well, okay, then we still need individual acts, or whether from persons or communities, and the systems, no, this tension. So the way, probably the message of the Catholic Church for the COP, it would be a strong emphasis of what Christine was saying between what the Pope has to do, you know, building bridges, the pontifex, no, between what's happening on the ground and the systems that are not working. So that will be an emphasis on that, on the message for COP. For that reason, we are going to go to the COP with the Laudato Si 7-year action plan already in place. So what we are doing is something that Martin Palmer even suggested, saying, listen, whether this COP is successful or not, for the Catholic communities and others that are joining us, there's no road back. We have committed ourselves to change our schools, to change our hospitals, to change our parishes, to change our families. I mean, we have already 300 schools in India, for example, sign up for this. So we are going to do this regardless of the success of this gathering. But we are here to support those politicians who are really ambitious and to turn upside down the model of development that is hurting people and planet. But for that, we know that this needs change. We know that this is conversion. And as religious people, we know that conversion cannot come in a fortnight. We know that it's a process of change of both individuals, persons, groups, and systems. And we are determined to do it, including us, including the church. Now we are studying, for example, in the Vatican, how can we, even if we haven't signed the Paris Agreement as such, but we want to achieve also the targets by reforming some buildings. That we want to show, as Martin Palmer was saying, and Christine also, and Dr. Rowan also was saying, we want to show that this is possible by doing things. So I would like to, Alex was calling for a new way of thinking, but I think, being a bit Augustinian, I think it's not just the thinking, it's the doing and the feeling. No? And Pope Francis has a very simple way of explaining it. So it's the mind, that the thoughts, the heart, the feelings, and the hands, the acts. The three are interconnected also. And we want to show that this interconnection of all are going towards a new way of acting, feeling, and thinking. There's no road back, believe me. Laudato Si took a while. Do you remember, Catherine, it took a while to set off, but now even other religions are taking Laudato Si very serious. Other people who are not necessarily religious, other politicians. So we in that sense, we have a lot of hope. And we want to, this is the new lobby, perhaps. It's the new lobby saying, we are going in that direction. We are going to support you if you're doing in that direction as well. Otherwise, I don't know.
Thank you ever so much. We've got a couple of questions coming in now and a couple of comments, but I'm afraid we're out of time, and we do need to let people go and not keep them longer than they have committed to. All eyes on Cornwall and the hearts, minds and hands there. Thank you so much for joining us. Do join us again for another briefing.